Hi folks, and welcome to the second Rosemary Speirs Leadership Grant webinar on how to ground your project in anti-oppressive and anti-racist practices. So to get right into it, I'd like to start off by acknowledging that in my context, the land that I work and live on is the unceded and unsurrendered traditional land of the Algonquin people. And that is something that is important to recognize, as that anywhere that we are on this land, we are on colonized land, which means that it was stolen and kept through violent and oppressive means. And therefore, it's important that when we are working as settlers and arrivants who have the privilege of living, existing, and doing this work, one that we did not earn on the unceded and unsurrendered land of multiple Indigenous groups across Turtle Island, that we are making sure that we are not only acknowledging those communities, but making sure to check in with them throughout our projects, and to not only check in with them, but make sure that their voices, their experiences are being seen and heard through the work that we do, trying to ensure that all of the work, the spaces, our actions are as decolonial as possible, and making sure that we are standing in solidarity with Indigenous peoples across this land. So we're doing a webinar on anti-oppression and anti-racism work. So to start off, what is oppression? For the definition, what we use is that oppression takes place when a person acts or a policy is enacted unjustly against an individual or group because of their affiliation to a specific group. This includes depriving people of a way to experience basic freedoms and human rights. So the reason why you hear that this doesn't have race necessarily specifically in this is that oppression is anything creates barriers, societal, systemic barriers against folks based off of, it can be their race, it can be their class, it can be their sexuality, it can be their gender, it can be their religious background. So we just want to acknowledge oppression as that and make sure that we are understanding it in the ways in which we are going to be moving forward to understand anti-oppressive work. For the next one, what is racism? I think it's a word that often we hear about, we interact with, but to give it a definition, racism is a system of disadvantage based on race. It empowers people with the ability to act on the belief that people of different races have different qualities and abilities, and that some races are inherently superior or inferior. Racism manifests in many ways, from dislike and avoidance of people based on their race to discrimination against them on an institutional level to acts of race-based violence. So it's to show that racism is pervasive in multiple different ways that it presents itself in society and on an individual level. And it's also important in today's context to acknowledge the fact that racism also employs systems of power, and that in those systems of power, races are further classified, which further disenfranchises certain, while it uplifts and validates and creates more importance for others. And to give power a definition, because I think that it's something that's very important to understand in the context of this presentation and this work, is that it's anything that has to do with having the access to resources, decision-making, decision makers, to have something that you want changed accomplished. Power is something that can be visible, it can be invisible, it can be hidden, it can show up as power over others, with others, in group. And it is something that is acquired at the expense of somebody else. So when you have power, it means that somebody else doesn't, right? So you're creating that dynamic, that power dynamic that you might often hear about, where someone is on top and someone is on bottom. And when we're doing work, especially community development work, we want to make sure that that is something that we are aware of, so that we are not, one, enacting harm through it, but also not recreating it in the work that we are doing or the community development that we are trying to see. So things to keep in mind, especially when it comes to racism. Racism impacts in many different ways and employs and interacts with many different systems and structures. For one, racism may be expressed in an overt manner, but also through everyday behavior that involves many small events in the interaction between people that is often described as everyday racism or individual racism. It can be subtle in nature. So a lot of the time we'll hear that racism is something that's overt or subtle, and a lot of time we have conversations about racism on a systemic, a structural, and institutional level, but it's also important to realize that everyone has an interaction, or everyone that is affected by racism has an individual interaction with that concept, right? And so understanding that there can be racism on a societal level, and that is something that we have to challenge, but understanding that whatever racism has as effects on a societal and institutional and structural level is maybe sometimes different, or also needs to be recognized in the ways in which it interacts with people on an individual or a more subtle manner. For number two, racism is evident in organizational and government policies, practices, and procedures, and normal ways of doing things, which may directly, indirectly, consciously, or unwittingly promote, sustain, or entrench differential advantage for some people and disadvantage for others. And this is known as systemic racism. So we live, work, exist within systems, and sometimes when we are looking at the ways in which society validates or doesn't validate people or normalizes certain things versus others, we see the ways in which systemically racism is also something that is becoming pervasive in the ways in which we are able to move through society. And so understanding that racism is something that also exists in even the ways that we think that some things are normal versus others. For example, when we think that it's normal to go to church on Sunday, for a lot of folks that's not necessarily something that is a norm. Or for some folks, the normalization of certain hairstyles, there are laws being enacted to stop certain folks to be able to work based off of even things as their hairstyle, or the way that we speak, seeing it the way that language is something that is normalized. There's a certain way to speak, and there's a certain way that's not necessarily as acceptable, right? And so it's important, once we've understood it on an individual level, that understanding that racism is also something that is seen in the ways in which we create and build our societies. Number three, racism is evident in cultural and ideological expressions that underlie and sustain dominant values and beliefs. It is evident in a whole range of concepts, ideas, images, and institutions that provide the framework of interpretation and meaning for racialized people throughout society. It is communicated and reproduced through agencies of socialization and cultural transmission, such as mass media, schools, colleges, and universities, religious doctrines and practices, art, music, and literature. It is also reflected in everyday language. So as we're continuing to understand racism, it's important when we say that a lot of the time, or you'll hear that racism is something that's conditioned into us, it's something that is subtly embedded in the way in which we interact with each other. It's because a lot of racist ideas are usually communicated in schools. The ways, what ways of learning, what knowledges are upheld versus other. The ways in which even sometimes who is teaching what in universities, in mass media, who is being vilified, who is being upheld, what kind of stories are being talked about, what kind are not. Which kind of art is being seen as valid, which kind of art isn't. Musically, we know that music that, for example, a lot of the time, rap is something that's seen as being more violent, more hostile, more ghetto, and usually those are linked to the same stereotypes that are upheld towards Black folks, whereas like pop is more bubbly and fun, more acceptable, more mainstream, and that is more acceptable music, right? And so seeing the ways in which in a lot of the ways that we interact in society and the ways in which we learn, the ways in which we are forced to go through certain agencies of socialization, we see that racism is something that is being taught to us, right? The ways in that thought process is being taught to us through this work. Number four, it's important to know that we do these presentations and trainings like this to recognize systemic barriers that exist and ones that may act out through our work because of unchecked privilege and bias. So it's really important to understand that this is a presentation about anti-racism and anti-oppression work, which inherently forces us to understand and check our privileges and biases, right? And so to make sure that in the work that we will be doing through these community development projects, that we are understanding not only anti-oppression and anti-racism, but our own biases and privileges that have led us to either subscribe or enact those things. rights. And to understand privilege, privilege is systemic advantages based on certain characteristics that are celebrated by society and preserved through its institutions. These can include being white, having money, being straight, not having disabilities. So society is very much so what says what is okay and what is not, right? And so when we're looking at privilege, it's whatever pieces of your identity or pieces of the ways in which you've been brought up and grown that allow you to have more doors open than others. For example, I'm an educated person, which means that I have an easier time in society than an uneducated person, because education is something that is upheld in society as being a valuable asset, right? And so, for example, we a lot of the time talk about white privilege, the fact that being white in a society in which whiteness is upheld as the norm, as the most valid, as the most important, that is a privilege. It's not something that was earned, it's something that people are born with and automatically makes life easier for them. Not having a disability, we know that a lot of spaces, a lot of policies, a lot of institutions are not accessible. And so understanding that having any type of disability, it makes it harder. And so as able-bodied people, as folks not dealing with disabilities, we already have those privileges, right? So it's understanding that privilege is something that can be earned, but a lot of the time is something that society has just deemed as being or giving you more validity, and is something that you have been able to acquire. And so bias is a subjective opinion, preference, prejudice, or inclination formed without reasonable justification that influences an individual or group's ability to evaluate a particular situation objectively or accurately, or preference for or against. So it's very important to put an emphasis on the fact that bias is a subjective opinion, which means that it's not based in fact, it's not based in anything that is concrete. It's based off of a personal opinion. So something that we have come to understand or learn or believe that we are now allowing to influence the ways in which we make decisions, the ways in which we act, the ways in which we interact with folks, the ways in which we work. So bias is something, for example, you may sometimes understand it interchangeably with prejudice, of just a judgment or an opinion of something based off of someone. So for example, if I'm someone that thinks that all Black people are violent, I'm going to stay away from Black people. That's a bias that I have, it's a prejudice that I have that affects how I interact with people. Or if I think that folks with learning disabilities can't get education, then that is a bias, that's a prejudice, that's not based in fact, that's not based in anything that is concrete. It's incorrect, it's inappropriate, it's a lot of things, but it's not something that is based objectively, and it does not allow you to interact with people objectively, and a lot of the time it doesn't allow you to interact with people humanely. And number 5, the last one, and most important one, is to understand that this presentation is not an extensive presentation. It will not cover all aspects of anti-oppression and anti-racism work. This is very much so just a base for you folks to get your community development projects up and running, and understand that you are not building your the foundation of your work in those ideals. It's always important. We love to say that Google is your best friend, and so it's always important to try and continue to further your equity knowledge in any way that you can, but make sure that you aren't burdening the people that have to go through the very things that you're learning about. So for now, it's time to set the groundwork for your project. And so to start, it's important that when we're picking the subject or theme of our projects, that we do the who, what, where, when, why, how. So that's something that even outside of anti-oppression and anti-racism work is a good tool to use to lay the groundwork for your projects, your work, whatever it may be that you are working on. Just to have a holistic approach of making sure that you understand your project and you're building a structure that will be able to be sustainable and make sense to you and whoever is interacting with your project. And grounding your work in anti-oppressive and anti-racist practices is not something you do as a simple overview of your project. It's something that has to be done in intention, and it has to be an intention that you set in every decision you make while laying the foundation of your project. So let's get started with the what. So what is your project? Is it grounded in anti-racist and anti-oppressive ideals? Is that something that you thought about when you chose what your project would be? As one of the first questions that you're going to ask yourself while building up this project, it is one of your first chances to question your intentions, survey the communities around you, interact with your privilege and bias, and so many other personal check-ins to make sure that it is a project that is not built inherently harmful. And so, as we're saying, it's important to think about what your project is. Did you think about the things that you needed to when you chose what your project was? But once you've chosen what your project is, whatever it is, it's important that you are checking in with yourself on what your intentions are, how you'll be able to interact, what your personal identity is, entering a community to do a project to make sure that once again, you are not being inherently harmful, you are understanding the context and how to be appropriate in approaching your project. Why are you doing this? So we talked a lot about intentions. It's important to remember that these projects are for community development, that this is an opportunity to step out of your personal experience and understand the diversity of identities and experiences and needs that in this context have to come first. So when we're talking about intention, whatever intention you set for yourself in this project, when you chose what the subject was, what the theme would be, it's important to realize that before any of that, the community that you are working with, the community in which you will be doing a community development project must come first. Their needs, their identities, their experiences must come first, especially because there's a diversity of them. You will not understand them all. They will not interact with your identity and experiences in a way that may be familiar to you. And so it's understanding that through your project, you need to make sure that you are doing the constant and continuing the check-ins to ensure that you are properly serving the community that you chose to interact with through this project. And so going back to the who, this is who your project is for. So we've talked about intentions, we talked about what the project is, but who is your project for? Who does it include? Who does it exclude? Who will it need to involve? Who are your partners? I think that it's important that you think of the diverse identities that are often left out of conversations and further marginalized by our actions. So as a person, you know what your identity and experiences are. We know that in a lot of the times, the reasons why we need to do community development projects is that folks are being disenfranchised, folks are being marginalized, folks are in need of community development work. And so it's important to think of the communities or the people within those communities that need this project and making sure that you are going out of your way. So that's a very important thing to remember. You're going out of your way to include those who are regularly and traditionally not included. Look into who is already doing this work in your community. When working on projects, when working on any project, whether it's a community development project or not, it can help you with capacity to know who is already doing that work. And furthermore, you never want to replicate the work that someone has already put their energy, their time, their passion into. It's not good for capacity. It's not necessary to repeat that work. And so you want to be respectful of the people who are already doing that work within your community and reaching out to them to see if this was an idea that you had, maybe in the resources that you are holding to do your project, you can support them in the work that they are already doing or have already done for the cause that you are now interested in. And then for partners, we talked about partners in this grant application, and it's important to think about who you'll be reaching out to. Create partnerships within community, especially with those who are already doing this work, as we mentioned. And it's always good to look at the practices and ethics of who you're partnering with. Anytime that you are creating a partnership. When we're talking about anti-oppressive work and anti-racist work, that goes down into even who we're getting our resources with, who we are partnering with, who we are inviting to our events, who we're interacting with through our campaigns, right? Who we're speaking to with the work that we're doing. And so when you're picking your partners, it's important that the the practices and ethics of those partners line up with the fact that your project has the intention of being anti-racist and anti-oppressive. And so making sure that those partners that you are picking aren't necessarily people who are out here building pipelines, or people who are out here displacing communities, or people who are out here supporting deportations, or people who are out here creating racist policies. So that's an important thing to look up and keep in mind. And it's once again something that you need to go out of your way to ensure that you are checking in with. Where is your project taking place? Is the way that you are setting it up contextually appropriate and reflective of the community's needs or asks? Can this context sustain this project? So make sure that the spaces you are choosing are accessible to diverse people. Always make sure to check in with the community when you are making decisions that will affect their ability to interact or be represented in or by your project. Cultural, religious, physical, mental, etc. accommodations are important to consider in all aspects. So when we're talking about the where, it's a plethora of things that we have to consider. So when we're saying things like, is it contextually appropriate? For example, if you are going to do a project on food insecurity, it's important that you are making sure that in the larger community, that it makes sense where you are putting that project, understanding which parts of the community are dealing with that specific topic. You need to make sure that for where you're landing your project, it's contextually sound and can be sustained by the context that you are setting it in. And so when we're talking about the where, that's one aspect about it, but we also have to consider that when we're saying that we want to make sure that the decisions that we make in this project will not negatively affect the community members' ability to interact or be represented in or by the project. It's things like making sure that the spaces we're choosing are accessible, making sure that we are thinking of the communities that are not always included in these projects, making sure that we are once again, and I'm going to repeat it through this presentation, that we are going out of our way to understand the best ways that we can serve those communities. So in all of the questions that we asked in the who, what, where, when, why, it's understanding just the diversity of ways in which those questions can be asked through our project, and making sure that in all of the ways that we are asking those questions, we are thinking about the needs, experiences, and identities of the community that we're working in, to make sure that when we're talking about anti-oppressive and anti-racist work, we are understanding the context that we are working in can support the work that we are doing, so that it makes sense for the community that we're working with. When are you hosting your project? Will you have enough time to make it as accessible as possible? And when we're talking about accessibility, it's important to understand that accessibility is a practice usually used to include people with disabilities. That's usually the conversations that we have. However, we must start looking at accessibility as making anything and everything completely, or as close to completely, barrier-free for everyone. And so give yourself enough time to put the right things in place to make sure that not only your project is accessible, but also, and sometimes most importantly, that it can be properly and genuinely serve the community that it is intended for. So when we're talking about especially contextually appropriate times, is that yes, we are giving you 6 months to complete your project, but you need to make sure that you have given yourself enough time to understand the community that you're working in, to make sure that your project can be sustained, to make sure that your project has the proper mechanisms in place to not be inherently harmful, like we said, to make sure that we are thinking about the things that have to do with not being oppressive and not being racist, to make sure that we are doing the check-ins with community in thinking about how our actions are impacting our project. So make sure that you are taking the time and steps to reach out to communities that may not be easily accessible. As someone who has done community organizing in Ottawa, for example, something that we often struggle with and continue to work on is making sure that we aren't just focusing and working with communities that are in the downtown core. There are a lot of racialized groups and a lot of Black communities in the suburbs, and those are the communities that we often don't go out and reach and talk to, right? So when we're doing that work and when we're doing that community development and community building work, it's important to think of the fact that yes, the downtown community is close, yes, it's easily accessible, yes, it's more engaged, yes, it may have had more interactions with the work that we're interested in, but that in those suburbs, there are members of the community that we are trying to interact with that should have the same access and the same interaction with our project, that also should be benefiting them. How did you do? How did you get it done? After completing a project, it is always important to do check-ins and survey the communities you are intending on serving. All projects will have their positives and their shortcomings. With community-based projects, when you're interacting with different identities, experiences, and needs, accountability is key both to your process and to your outcomes. Remember, impact is more important than intention. And so as the last part of the who, what, where, when, why, how, it's important that when you think about how you got your project done, how did you go through the process, how did you make sure that you were making this community-based community development work for your community, that you think about how you were accountable, how you put those things in place, how you ensured that they would be sustainable, how you made sure to check in with communities in a way that you thought of being anti-oppressive, anti-racist. Were you yourself making sure that you were checking in with your biases, your privileges? Were you checking in on how your impact, what kind of impact you were having? And so the project is just as important as what happens after the project. So after any time I work on a project, it's important for me to go back to the community that I worked with to make sure that not only the work that I did was beneficial to them, but to make sure that I'm learning from the actions that were both positive and negative, from the steps that I took that I may not be able to take next time because they may have harmed certain people, but get an understanding of the process and the procedures that affected the community just as much as the end product. And so when we're talking about anti-oppressive and anti-racist work in the context of these development projects, it's also important, as one of the last things that we will touch on, to consider non-partisanship. So although Equal Voice is a multi-partisan organization, your projects will have to be non-partisan. And so nonpartisan just means, or nonpartisanship just means not biased or partisan, especially towards any particular political group. And it's important to keep in mind that your activities must be nonpartisan and therefore welcoming of different political ideals, affiliations, and backgrounds. And so if you are someone who is of one of the parties, that you are making sure that that isn't something that is clear and exclusive within your project, because it should be welcoming of folks from any different background, any different belief, as long as we are making sure that first and foremost, our projects are anti-oppressive and anti-racist. But it's also important to make sure that we aren't letting our partisanship bleed through in our work, because in communities, folks believe and come from a lot of different backgrounds, and that they should be equally welcome and understood and be able to interact with your project. These are a few frequently asked questions that we wanted to put up just as they have come in. If you have any other questions, you can always email us at dlv-hds@equalvoice.ca, or you can email one of your delegate coordinators, who will be the people who have been corresponding with you recently. But after all of this, we wanted to thank you a lot for your time.